frustration, shame, and anxiety. Those are emotions that often get confused with anger and guilt, or they often have some overlap or they're related in some way. Let's talk about frustration. So, frustration is the difference between the way that I want things to be or think they should be and the way that I perceive that they actually are. So the difference between the way that I want things to be or think they should be and the way that they actually are, the way that I perceive them, the reality of them. So let me give an example here. Say I really wanted to go for a bike ride, but I don't want to bike in the rain. And so I'm getting ready to go for a bike ride and I look outside and it's raining. I might be frustrated because what I would like to be doing is biking, and I would like to be biking in not rainy weather, in sunny weather. But that's not what's happening right now. It's raining, and so I might be frustrated. Some people might feel disappointment, right? They're similar emotions, they just feel different. Frustration feels a little more closer to anger, disappointment feels a little bit closer to sadness, but very similar concepts. But no one owes me anything. No one's harming me. No one's like purposely making it rain so that I can't go on my bike ride. Right. So I'm frustrated, but it's not justified anger. I'll give another example. Say I'm waiting in line at like some type of drive-through, and there's just a lot of cars. Maybe it's just that time, like it's like lunchtime, and there's just a lot of cars in line, and I'm frustrated because I got to get back to what I'm doing, and I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to wait in this long line, so I'm frustrated. And it's not justified anger because no one really owes me anything. No one owes me a duty to not order their order, not order. Maybe if they're having like a big order of food, they get to do that. Maybe it's a coffee shop and they're ordering a lot of blended drinks. That takes a long time. They have a right to do that. Right. So there's not harm being done to me. I'm just frustrated because it's not the way I would like it to go. So when you experience what feels like anger, I would just consider pausing and asking those four different category questions. This like bigger idea of like, did someone harm me? And if the answer is no, most likely it's frustration. And then you want to ask yourself, if it is frustration, like, do I really want to go through the energy to really change the situation? Can I even change the situation? Do I even have control over that? Because oftentimes we don't. So that's where unjustified anger, we want to just look at what the action we would take, right? Because it'd be a very different action. We'd work on letting the anger go, discharging in another way, maybe like going for a walk or doing something physical to get the energy out, but we wouldn't need to take a self-protective action. So there is overlap because oftentimes when I'm being harmed by someone, justified anger, I don't want to be experiencing that. Like I don't want to be harmed by someone. So that's also frustration. The difference between the way I would like things to be going and the way that they actually are. There's actually a huge overlap that anger really falls within the bigger umbrella of frustration. But there's going to be situations where you're frustrated and not angry. But rarely, I don't know if anything, where you're angry and not frustrated, right? There's a lot of overlap there. So let's talk about shame, because that often has an overlap and gets confused with guilt, or they're related. Shame is really a signal that we have violated or consider violating a community standard of some kind. So when I say it's justified shame or rational shame, it means that we have broken some type of community standard or norm or rule. And that could be within our family, that could be within our friend group, that could be at work, that could be in a religious or spiritual community, that could be society at large, that could be in our neighborhood, that could be so many things in terms of when we're talking about group standards or community standards. So when we violated something like that, that would be rational or justified shame. I'll give you an example. Say you grow up in a family where honesty is really important, and then you lie. That would be breaking that community standard, the standard of not lying and being honest. And so if I experience rational shame, that would make sense. Now, the second part is really important here because not all justified shame do we want to take the same action. There's two different routes here. One route is course correct. I want to change my behavior up because my values align with the community standards. And so I do want to change my behavior and get back on track and not engage in that behavior that's breaking that community standard. So we go back to that honesty example. If honesty was also important to me, then I'd probably want to make amends, right? There's going to be some guilt because I also harmed someone in the lying as well. So this is where guilt and shame often overlap. So there's probably harm that's been done by lying. And there's also shame because I broke the community standard of honesty. And if honesty, again, is important to me, then I'd want to apologize, make amends with the people that I lied to, and then work on being honest in the future. Well, what happens when the community standard does not match up with our values? Because that happens. We don't always want to course correct and change ourselves in what we believe. I'll give an example. So I'm queer and I grew up in the Catholic Church. And queerness in the Catholic Church don't really tend to go well together. I got a lot of messages that it was wrong and sinful and bad to be gay. And so being in that church environment, I did experience shame. And that was rational and justified shame because I was breaking a community standard by just being myself and being in queer relationships, romantic relationships. Now, at some point in my life, I decided that I don't want to conform to this standard anymore. It goes against literally who I am and my values and how I want to live my life, which is I want to be authentic to myself and I want to be in relationships that, loving relationships. And so I decided to go against the community standard. So that's the other option. I'm not going to course correct. I'm not going to change who I am. I'm not going to change my behavior. Um, I'm going to choose to not abide by the community standards and rules and norms. But with that, you have to be willing to deal with whatever the consequences are. And that's where it gets complicated because oftentimes the consequences are excommunication, exclusion, rejection, and sometimes even harm. It can be unsafe to not go along with the community standards. But sometimes it feels really important to break free from those community standards. So those are the two paths that you can take when you experience shame. You can either course correct and change your behavior, make amends, and continue on with the community standards, or you can do something different. But you have to be willing to deal with the consequences. So if you're not willing to deal with the consequences, then really there's a third option, and that's to just conform in public, but know in private that you're working maybe towards nonconformity and moving away from those community standards until you're ready publicly to deal with the consequences of that. So that's shame. And again, there's a lot of overlap because oftentimes when we do something that's harmful, we're also breaking a community standard. Not always, right? So the honesty lying example, that's where they overlap. But the queer example, I'm not hurting anyone by being myself and being in consensual, loving adult relationships. So I don't have rational or justified guilt, but I would have shame in terms of the church community because of their community standards. So let's talk about the third emotion that tends to come up a lot and get confused and can happen at the same time as anger and guilt, and that's anxiety. So anxiety is a signal to let us know that we're about to be harmed or there's some type of potential harm, but it's different than anger because it can involve people, but it can involve animals, it can involve natural disasters, it can involve a lot of things. It's really more of a threat to your survival is really what that signal is about with anxiety. And then the drive is to get us to protect ourselves. So that's where it does feel very similar to anger, but anxiety is a lot broader. It's not just with harm from people, it's harm and a threat to our survival as a whole. And so there might be times where we experience anger and anxiety at the same time, because maybe some of the harm that's coming at us from someone is a threat to our survival. Or maybe we're anxious because we're thinking about needing to take that self-protective action. That means that there's going to be conflict and we're going to need to assert ourselves. We might have anxiety with that. Another time when anxiety and anger get confused is when we feel anxious, we can go into a fight or flight response. And think about that fight response. That can often feel like anger, very similar. Because when we're thinking about anger, we really are getting ready to protect ourselves. That could be fighting back. That could also be running away. So sometimes anxiety has some similar signals to anger. And sometimes people really want to stay in the anger part because that feels more self-protective and that feels more powerful. Anxiety can feel more vulnerable. And so for some people, they often, when it's actually solely anxiety, they'll switch into an anger mode because that feels more protective. So we just want to be cautious when we feel anger. We really want to go through that process of asking, has someone harmed me? Is this really anger or is this frustration? Is this anxiety? Is this something else? Am I also responding to the present moment, or am I being triggered about from a past trauma or a past situation? That's where anxiety can also really show up, and really get confused with anger. Maybe in the past, I was angry in that situation where I was being harmed. In the present day, I'm not being harmed, but it reminds me of that past situation. And so that's really being triggered about a past trauma or past situation. And so we just need to be really cautious. It goes through that 7 stages of emotional wellness, right? Like, what emotion are we actually feeling? What's the purpose of it? What's this emotion trying to help me understand or tell me or get me to do to help me and protect me and to get my needs met? And then what's the most appropriate action? And then how can I take that action? So those are the main emotions that connect with anger and guilt: frustration, shame, and anxiety.